All right, so we're going to go through each of these different institution examples, and we're going to see really the difference between settler and extractive colonies. So in the settler colonies, they really wanted to encourage immigration. Hey, come here. We're all settlers. Again, there's plenty of land out in the wilderness, so no problem. Come on in. Whereas an extractive colony, there's essentially, we're at the top of this pyramid. We don't really want to share that with anybody else. We're extracting all the wealth. We want to keep the wealth for ourselves. And we can see this in just the immigration data, that the share, so this white will be the Spaniards, the share white in Spanish America much lower than in the US and Canada. Essentially, the immigrants in this time period are white immigrants from Europe. And so we can see by 1825, the US is mostly white, similar with Canada. This is due to immigration. Okay. Whereas in these countries, which are built on extraction, much smaller European migration to them. Okay. And much higher, especially in Brazil, much higher numbers of imported slaves from Africa as a percentage of the population. All right, land. So this is a big deal. So many of these countries expand into the interior, and there's a bunch of land that is taken from the natives in this time period. And the question is, what do we do with this land? In the US and Canada, we have the Homestead Act and the Dominions Land Act. In Canada, essentially, it's granted to the population. Like, if you want it, you go out, you settle on it, and boom, you can have the land. In the more extractive colonies, when this land gets taken, it is divvied up amongst the elite. So massive land grants to the elite families. Instead of saying, hey, we're going to open this land up to the entire population, as not the entire population, obviously, there's just the in this period, it's just the free settlers. And so this has huge consequences for the distribution of land. So very low levels of land ownership in 1900. This is 1910, sorry, early 1900s in Mexico versus incredibly high ownership in the US. Now, also notice in this data in the US, though, you can see the difference between the North and the South. Remember, the South is much more extractive, and you can see the rates of land ownership in the South, South Atlantic, South Central, much lower than in the West or in the North. So you can even see those differences between extractive and settler colonies play out within the U.S. Okay, political rights. Your settler colonies are going to have things that look like democracy. The voting franchise extended. Okay, so basically the way you want to look at this is no is good. So no wealth requirement, meaning more people can vote. No literacy requirement. And there's a secret ballot. Okay. And so you can look at that in the US and Canada basically have these things, or they have, the franchise is extended, much more than it is in most Latin American countries, Chile being the exception. Chile and Argentina are actually a bit of a edge case. They're a little bit more like settler colonies than they are extractive colonies. But they're sort of an intermediate case because they end up pursuing some exclusive extractive institutions kind of midway through. And that's sort of why they end up on a lower track, but they still, relative to the rest of Latin America, they traditionally have been richer. Okay, schooling, we have an investment in public goods, and we can see this in the literacy rates. So we go to Canada and the US, very high literacy rates compared to some of your Latin American and Central American countries. All right. And so basically the argument, as we said, is like these institutions after industrialization are conducive to growth. So it's like these type of institutions don't really matter before growth, but once you have that technological progress, that ability to create new technology, these are the institutions that do it. And so industrial revolution gets easily imported to the northern U.S. The South, again, you want to think is primarily an agrarian economy. Even up to and after the Civil War, the South really lags behind the North. It's much poorer than the North at the onset of the Civil War, continues to be much poorer after the Civil War, basically until the mid 20th century, when the South finally kind of catches up a little bit to the rest of the U.S. Okay, and so these institutions are, very conducive to growth after the Industrial Revolution, and so this is why we see the differences up here. But even within Latin America, we see some differences. These colonies down here are more Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. They're much more closer to the settler, and Mexico has some parts that are closer to the settler colonies. And then this HDI looks good for Costa Rica because Costa Rica has super high literacy rates. They essentially abolished their military, I think, in the 60s, and invested heavily in education. Okay, and then the numbers out of Cuba. This is Cuba. I would not believe the GDP numbers out of Cuba. HDI is based on GDP, life expectancy, and education. Really, I won't believe the GDP numbers out of Cuba, nor would I believe the life expectancy. Those numbers are a little juked. So that's maybe why we get they're green. Okay. Next up, we're going to look at a specific institution and show its long-term effects.